We're going to start a new Mishnah today, Mitzvah Hashem, on Daf Lamed Amid Beis. Now, as you remember, the Masechet began with a list of 15 arayos. And if any of those 15 arayos fall for Yibum, then there's no Yibum, there's no Chalitza. And now the Mishnah adds something to that original Mishnah. But Kulon, with regard to all these 15 arayos that are listed, they patter up that Saras for Yibum as well. See, Hayu Bahen Kiddush. Now we're talking about a case, and we'll try to fill it in with names, where there was Kiddushin. In other words, one of these arayos had a marriage relationship with one of the brothers. And it was what's called a Safek Kiddushin. Let's say, for example, you have Reuven and Shimon, and let's say Shimon marries Sarah. In addition to that, he was Makadesh Rivka. So Shimon is married to Sarah, and he gave Kiddushin to Rivka. Now, the relationship between Rivka and Reuven, right, if let's say Shimon dies, is that of an Erva. However, the Kiddushin of Rivka were Kiddushay Safek. The Mishnah is going to explain what happened, what's a case of Safek Kiddushin. We're not sure whether or not the Kiddushin is valid. So now, the status of Rivka, who is a relative of Reuven, is such that she's a Safek Ishto Shel Shimon, which means that on the side that we validate that marriage relationship between Shimon and Rivka, then Sarah is what's called a Tsaras Erev, because again, Rivka is an Erev to Reuven. Now, is Rivka actually falling for Yibum to Reuven with the death of Shimon? We don't know. That all depends upon whether the Kiddushin of Shimon to Rivka was valid or not valid. And therefore, the status of Sarah vis-a-vis Reuven is a Safek Tsaras Erev. In other words, there's no question about it that Reuven cannot be the Yabim Rivka. That's upgrade, because Rivka is an Erva to Reuven. But the question now is whether Sarah is a Tsaras Erva to Reuven. And that depends on this Safek. Oh, Gerishin the Safek. Okay, with the Gemara, the Mishnah is going to talk about Gerishin the Safek in a minute, where once again, we have a situation where there's an Erva, and the question is, was she actually married to Shimon? Well, she once was married to Shimon, but Shimon gave her a Safek get. Now, if that get is valid, then Rivka is not married to Reuven. Rivka is not married to Shimon, and therefore Sarah is not a Tsaras Erva to Reuven. Right? This is a classic case of a Safek Erva in Yibum. On the side that there's no Erva, she needs at least the barest minimum Chalitza. On the side that it is an Erva, she doesn't need Chalitza at all. She's a Tsaras Erva. But L'chumra, we're not going to allow her to get married without Chalitza. Case had Safek Kiddushin. What is the scenario of a Safek Kiddushin? So now here we have what's called Zrika, otherwise known as Safek Karav Law, Safek Karav Lo. And this applies to both Kiddushin and Gerish. Let's start backwards with the case of Gerish. The Torah says, V'nasan b'yada, Sefer Krisos. So for a get to be valid, he's got to put the get into her hands. Alternatively, he can throw the get and it lands in a place that's accessible to her. But the halacha requires, in order to constitute a Messina, that if he throws the get, it leaves his rishus and goes and enters into her rishus. So how do you define a domain? There's his domain and hers. It's karav law is considered her domain. She can run and get access to the get before he can, theoretically. It doesn't matter how fast he runs and she. But it's karav law. It's more karav to the Megarish, then it's not a Gerish, it's not an Asim. And Garnish Kishof, nothing happened. Same thing in Kiddushin. A man is Mekadesh and Isha with Kesef, and he throws the Kesef in her direction, and he put it on her hand or on, let's say, a stone that she owns, or on the ground. That's one thing, but he just threw it. So that's the Mishnah here says, Safek Kiddushin is Zorak La Kiddushin, and Safek Karav Lo, Safek Karav Lo. So Rashi gives the following example. Let's say that he and she are standing at a distance of 8 amos. So the point that's 4 amos away from him is also 4 amos away from her. That's the midpoint between the two, equidistant to both him and her. If he threw the Kiddushin and it landed 4.1 amos away from him, that means 3.9 amos closer to her. That's called karov law, and then the Kiddushin is valid. If on the other hand he threw the Kiddushin and it fell 3.9 amos away from him, which is 4.1 amos away from her, then ain't a Kiddushin. We don't know exactly where it fell, or alternatively, if we know where it fell, we don't know where he exactly was positioned and she was exactly positioned. So we're not sure. It really landed midway between the two, but we're not sure in which direction they land before it got to her or after it got to her. That was Safek Kiddushin. That's the case of Safek Kiddushin. Now, here we have a very, very great problem, which I don't know how to solve right now. I'm hoping that when we get to the Gemara, we'll figure out a solution. Every woman has what's called a cheskas pnuya until we know for sure that she was bekudeshes, otherwise known as a cheskas heter, an assumption that she can marry anyone. You want to argue that she's married and she can't marry anyone, then the burden of proof is on you to establish, to change her chazak. She has a cheskas muteres l'shuk. And therefore, in this context, since we're not sure whether the Kedusha was valid or not, then we have to assume it's not valid. Based on a suffix, we can't take a woman out of her cheskas heter. And that's a basic principle. And that's going to lead us to the conclusion here that this entire sugya is all d'Rabbanan. Meaning on a Doraisa level, Sarah really falls for evil. And there should be evil, because she's definitely not a Sarah Erva, because the Safek Kiddushin to what was her name? The other one was Rivka, I think we called her. Right, that Safek Kiddushin to Rivka is not recognized. It's not a valid Kiddushin because she has a Cheskes Heter. So the requirement of Chalitza in this case is certainly Doraisa. No question that Sarah falls for evil and she can't get married. She's Yevamot Shuk without Chalitza. But the Lo Misya Bemes is a Gzeres Chacham. Now, why would the Chacham make such a Gzera and therefore undermine and disqualify Yibum? So the answer is that the Chachamim are worried that maybe the Kiddushin actually came closer to Rivka than it was closer to him. Now, what's the case of Safek Gerish? Again, Kosav Biksav Yodo, V'enal of Edim, or Yeshel of Edim. Right, so we have two types of get. We could have a get that's written in the actual handwriting of the Baal, and we don't even need 2 signatures. Rabbi, so you know what that's called? By chance, would you know? I mean, I'm just asking. That's called Ede Mesira Karse. Are you familiar with that? No. Do we still have that thing? Oh, this is Kedai to write down. All right, we'll try to squeeze it in here.
I'll get it.
That's okay. It's right. Ede Mesira Karse. Now, the opposite of this is called Ede Chasima Karse. Right, so the word karse means to be chorus. That's the verb of creases. And if you hold Edi Chasima Karse, then there's no such thing as a get without the signature of two Edim. Like any document that has to serve as what's called a shtar raya, a get has to serve as a shtar raya. If it is a shtar raya, which means when she's holding on to the get, she can prove that she received the get because there are two Edim signed on the get, then the get is valid. But if there are no signatures on the get, then if you hold Edi Chasima Karse, it's not worth the paper it's written on. But our sugya, and that's how we pass the halacha, holds that Ede Mesira Karse means we just need two Edim watching him deliver a get. They read the get. They know he signed the get. I mean, he wrote the get. It's written like an ayu, in his handwriting. So now we have two options here. The Gemara establishes that even according to Mandiyam, who holds Ede Mesira Karse, he also agrees that Ede Chasima Karse. He's only adding another alternative. He's not subtracting, he's adding. So therefore, the Mishnah mentions two possibilities here. One is Ksav Yodo v'Einol of Edim, which means Ede Mesira Karse. And the other is Yeshal of Edim. There are two Edim signed on the get, on the shtar. The Ein Bo Zman. Okay, we'll have to see about Ein Bo Zman. The Gemara establishes in Gittin that they made a takana in Gittin to write the Zman, to write the date. Now, the words Ein Bo Zman in this Mishnah go back on both cases. Either it's a Ksav Yad V'Einol of Edim, or it's Yeshal of Edim, but it's Ein Bo Zman. The Rabbanan require the get to have a Zman. And if the get doesn't have a Zman, then with Rabbanan it's possible. Now, in the case of Ksav Yado, the Einol of Edim, since there are no Edim signed on the get, then there is no Zman. Right? It's the Edim who add the Zman, but we don't have Edim on this get. He writes here in the name of Tosfos that Kevon she'ein Edim chasumim olav, since there's no signature in this first case of Kosev Ksav Yado, yesh lachu shemashina v'lo kosev bos hazman hanochon shel ksivas haget. Only when Edim are signed on a get do they testify that this man is not meticulous. What's the word? Is accurate, right? The accuracy of the date is part of the testimony of the Edim. That has to do with the halacha of chakiros, right? Every pair of witnesses has to be subject to interrogation, and one of the interrogations is the Ezazman. You have to tell me what day of the week it was and what week of the year it was, etc., etc. In a case of Ksav Yado, V'Einol of Edim, Ein Chasum of Edim, then there's no reliable Zman. Zman, it has to be part of the Edus. And now we have a case of Yeshal of Edim, but the Edim forgot, they ignored the requirement of Zman. So in both of these cases, the Rabbanan passel the get because of the absence of Zman. The Torah doesn't require Zman. The Torah just says because of let's say for creases, which means Harei at megureshes mimeni muteres l'chol adam. That's what it says in the get. On a derisa level, biblically, there's no requirement to Zman. But the Rabbanan possibly get without his Zman. And we'll see why. Emir Sashem. He says, V'afal gav to me ikar adin ain't tzarech lichtov Zman beget. That's on a derisa level. Tiknu chachamim lichtov bo Zman. And I'm wondering if he quotes the whole sugya, the machlokes, why. Oh yeah, look at that. He has the whole sugya git yud zayin. Right, so it's machlokes, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Why did the chachamim establish that a get has to have a zman? And one possibility is shem yechap al bas achoso, which means that's Rabbi Yochanan's opinion, that if, let's say, his wife chas v'shalom, right, had an adulterous relationship, so he wants to cover up for her. Why? Because she is his niece. The special mitzvah to marry your sister's daughter. And he has a special chiba and also family issues, whatever it might be. So what he does is he writes a get, gives her a get, and he predates the get. So let's say she had his nus relationship on the 1st of January, he's going to write the 1st of December, backdated. So in order to avoid that kind of shenanigans, the Rabbanan require a get with two witnesses that sign and testify that the get was given on the 1st of December, not the 1st of January. You follow what I mean? And Reish Lakish says Mishum Seder de Lekuchos. Let's just see if Lakish here. Second. Oh, Reish Lakish Amar Hatam shetiknu zman kidei shelo tafsid. Oh, now I understand. We're talking about, but both, you know what Nichsei Malug is, right? Nichsei Malug, she brings in certain, let's say, properties, a piece of real estate, and during the course of the marriage, he could rent out that property, and all the rental fees accrued to him within the context of a ksuba. Alternatively, she has a field, and the field gets the status of nifsei malug. He eats the fruits that are produced by the field. Now, if he wants to cheat his wife and get payros that are really post-get, meaning once she has the get and the chalos gerish is chal, he forfeits his rights to eat the payros of nifsei malug. All he has to do is post-date the get. And he'll get himself an extra month or whatever of achilus payros. He says, "Harei lechol baal yesh zchus lechol payros nifsei malug shel ishto ad sheyigarshena. V'im lo yichtov zman beget." Oh, forget about what I said before that he post-dates the get. Let's say he leaves out the get. So yesh lochos shem yamshich lechol payros shel nifsei malug. He's going to continue eating from the fruits of our field illegally. We won't be able to sue him in a court of law and prove that he had no rights to these payros because yuchal litlo shenisgasha. So he's going to claim a post-dated get, so to speak. There is no date in the get. He's going to claim the get was not on the 1st of December, but rather it was on the 1st of January. And therefore, I was rightfully eating all the payros during the month of December. But once we fulfill the rabbinic requirement, the takana of zman beget, get mochiach that she already got the get on the 1st of December, and all the parents that he ate during the course of December, he has to return to her. I mean, if the parents are eaten already, he'll just have to pay for the parents. Now we have a third case of a get that's possible midrabanan. What's that? Yesh bo zman. Okay, so we finished up with the problem of the absence of Zman. We now have Zman in the get, but Ein Bo Ella Eid Echad. Okay, so this is another sugya we set begin. What happens if there's only one witness signed on the get? So the Gemara in Gittin on Daf Pei Vav quotes Rav, and Rav says that this get was written by the Baal. So we have his handwriting. On top of that, there's an aid, one single witness signed on the bottom. And we just finished saying that according to the Torah law, he doesn't even need that one aid signed on the bottom. As long as it's written in his own handwriting, given and delivered in front of the two witnesses, then it's chal and it's a valid get on a deraisa level. The Tana is now adding that if there's one aid besides Ksav Yado, even in that case, the get is possible. Why? So Shmuel in Masechet Gittin on Pei Vav says the following: the actual writing of the get was done by the sofer, and there was one aid signed in the get. Now, when the husband writes a get, he cannot qualify as an aid to testify in his own get. He's a baldova. But the sofer can testify on this get because he wrote the text of the get and he recognizes his signature. Chachamim, and add that to the aid that's signed on the bottom of the get. You now have two aidim on the get, even though there's only one signature, but there are two aidim on the get. Chachamim paslu get zeh. Why? Yesh lachu shema sofer kosav as a get l'slave v'zorku ba'ashpa motzav baal hichtem olavedecha v'girish pa. When we find something irregular in a get, we're always afraid that maybe the Baal found this get and it was not written lishma. And a get is only kosher when it's written lishma, l'shem haba. So it's very possible that this get was a practice get. It was not commissioned by the Baal. The sofer was just practicing his expertise. I don't know if you heard about the story with the Birkas Hamazon. Did you hear about that story? Okay, that's an interesting story in and of itself. I don't want to botch it for you, but should I botch it for you? Because we don't have time for the whole story. But there was a sofer that was he was a new on the block, and nobody wanted to hire him. And he was very, very upset about it. He was depressed. He couldn't put food on his table. Anyway, so one time he accepted upon himself that he would not bench unless he had a birkom, not by heart. It was a chumrah that he accepted upon himself. And the reason he accepted upon himself is because he had read about one of the 45 men that were killed in Meron. I forgot the name right now. And he read about that person that he, the eulogies that this young man, he was married, this young man who died, would never bench without Birkat Hamazon. So this sofer took it upon himself never to bench without a Birkat Hamazon. And the story goes that he was in a shul, and he was pretty down on himself at that time. But anyway, he had eaten something he had to bench, and he looked around the shul to find a birkon. He found a birkon in the shul that was handwritten. And he was nispal from the beautiful script. He had never seen a script like that. So he decided to copy over the script. The next day, there was someone who wanted to commission the writing of a Sefer Torah and called up one of this sofer's buddies. And the buddy said, maybe you take my friend. He's a sofer. So they said, send over an example, a sample of his writing. So he sent over this Birkat Hamazon that he had just copied over the day before. They were dispelled from the beauty of it. And they hired him, and it was many thousands of dollars, commissioned him to write a Sefer Torah. What became clear, these people wanted to write a Sefer Torah as a memory of one of those who perished in Meron. And who were they writing it in memory of? That person who had taken it upon himself never to bench without a Birkat Hamazon. Amazing story. So in any event, this get that we find, and it's got only one signature on it, and we want to assume that we can integrate the Eidus of one aid, that signature together with the Sofer, but maybe it wasn't written with Shema. Chachamim paslu get zeh mishum sheyesh lochus Shema Sofer kosav v'saget lehislamed. He was just copying of her get in order to train himself. It was an exercise training in Safrus. Bizarko ba'ashpa, and maybe it was thrown out. Somebody read it and it happened to have the name Shimon on it, so they gave it to Shimon, and Shimon used it to divorce his wife. So the Rabbanan Pasel this get, I guess because, if I'm not mistaken, because of the irregularity of finding one's aid on the get. That's irregular. Even though on a Doraisa level, we don't have to worry that maybe he wrote it Shalol L'Shma and the Baal just found it, and the Sofer was only writing it L'Slamed. When Torah I get caution. Shestam Sofer Nizar B'Kaf. A sofer would not write a get as a matter of training and then throw it into the rubbish. Shema mechashash Shema Yovi Adover L'Michshol. Maybe somehow this get is going to get into the hands of a Baal who has the same name. Imagine the name is Moshe. Every other guy has the name Moshe, right? Or if you're in Tzatmar, it's Yoel. So Lakach Min HaTorah gets that caution because he could be Mitzaref the signature of one aid together with that of the writing of the Sofer. Don't rely on this get. Zeu Safek Gerushin. So we now have 3 examples of a Safek Gerushin. Again, we're going to have to analyze this Mishnah, because why doesn't the Mishnah give the obvious case where he threw the get and we're not sure if it was 4 amos plus or 4 amos minus? Safek Karav Lo, Safek Karav Lo. But the Mishnah is teaching me other dinim about these 3 gittim. So again, Shimon gave a get to Rivka, his wife, and it was one of these 3 gittim. And now Shimon has another wife named Sarah, and when Shimon dies and Sarah and Rivka fall for Yibum, if Rivka is an erva, then we would think that Sarah has the status of a Tzara's erva, but we're not sure if the get was valid or not. The get that Shimon delivered to his wife, Rivka. Im girei Shimon es Rivka ishto b'achad mishloshes gitin alalu meis, right? So Shimon dies, and now the question is whether Rivka falls for Yibum to Ruvain, right, together with Sarah. B'dino kisafik migureshes v'tzarasa choletzes v'lo misyabemes. Batam b'din zeh mashetzrichu lachlots. Right, so why is this chalitza a requirement? I mean, after all, Sarah is now a Tzaras Erev. But the answer is she might not be a Tzaras Erev, because maybe the get that was delivered to Rivka was valid. Now he adds another point to the equation, that it could be that although the Rabbanan were not happy with any of these 3 gittim that we mentioned earlier, But b'di'evet, if the get was given, the Rabbanan did not undermine the status of the get, which would mean now that what? That Sarah is not a Tsaras Erva, because Rivka received the get. Now, what does it mean that b'di'evet the get is chal? It doesn't mean that she's allowed to get married based on a get which the Rabbanan disqualified, but it means that if the Rabbanan disqualified the get and then she got married to someone else, they're not going to break up the marriage to someone else. That's called b'di'evet. Since on a doraisa level, her get was valid and she's not an Eishes Ish. So he says, in any of these three cases, she got married. Right, we're not going to consider as if they're not married. We'll recognize the divorce, and therefore the marriage subsequent to that divorce is a valid marriage. So 1 second. So now, what are we saying? It's Sarah. Right, so on a Daraisa level, Sarah should be able to fall for Yibum to Ruvain. And as Ruvain should be able to be Avim Sarah. Why? Because in the meantime, Rivka got married to someone else. And why do we recognize her marriage to someone else? Because b'di'evet, these three Gittin are recognized and validated once she got married to someone else. So that would mean that Sarah is not a Tsaras Erva to Reuven. So Reuven should be able to be Miyabim. Ach eina v'syabemes lefi shepasul chachamim getze lechatchila. Lechatchila, we would have to write a second get to replace the first one. In any of these three cases of Ksav Yodav Ein Olav Eidim, or Yesh Olav Eidim Ein Bozman, or Eid Echad on the get.
Do we have to write a new get?
Again, we have three cases where the get that was delivered from Shimon to Rivka was disqualified bin Rabbanan, either because there was no Zman, or the other case where we had only one aid signed on the get. In all those cases, the Rabbanan say that she needs a replacement get to get married. Again, if she got married and took the law into her own hands, that's something else. But she needs a get. We don't recognize this get. We disqualify this get. So if we disqualify the get, then again, Chos V'niyar, then Sarah becomes a Tsaras Erva. So therefore, Yibum is not a possibility. Eina Misyabemes, Kevan Sheposlu Chachamim get Zelechatchila. Memela he Tsaras Erva Gebura. Just 1 second, I'm missing something here. Oh, I see. What happens now is if we would allow Yibum and Reuven would be Miyabim Sarah, the spectator, I don't use that word, but I mean it looks like towards the public that you're allowed to be Miyabim Tsaras Erva. Why does Sarah look like a Tsaras Erva? Because the Rabbanan said that this get, at least of Shimon to Rivka, is not a valid get. They wouldn't rely on this get. They would require a replacement get. So since they would require a replacement get, in the eyes of the spectator, it looks like this get is not valid. And if this get is not valid, the Mela Sarah is a Tsaras Erva. And if Reuven goes ahead, if you allow Reuven to be Miyabim Sarah, then in the eyes of the spectator, you're allowed to be Miyabim Tsaras Erva. So we can't let that go by. So therefore, Eina Misyamemis. Now, if you ask me why she needs chalitza, so that's clear because on a deraisa level she fell for yibum. She's not in tzoras erva because the get in any of these three cases is a valid get. Rabbana made a takana requiring zman in a get. Rabbana made a takana that if it's an irregularity and you're relying on the ksav yad of the sofer, then we don't know. Maybe the sofer wrote it without being commissioned to write it. There's no lishma in the get. The sofer wrote it l'slamet. And the Rabbanan now are going to disqualify the get. On a deraisa level, the get is kosher. If the get is kosher on the deraisa level, then that means that Sarah is not a tzoras erva, and she falls for yibum. We're not going to allow yibum, as we said before, but we must get chalitza. Because on a deraisa level, she requires chalitza. So the Rabbanan are not going to allow yibum for Sarah because the onlooker will mistakenly think that she's a tzoras erva. Why do they think she's a tzoras erva? The answer is because Shimon had delivered a get, which the Rabbanan impossible to his wife Rivka, who was an erva to Ruvain, and to the best of the knowledge and the impression of the onlookers, that get was not valid. And if that get was not valid, then Sarah is a tzoras erva. That's what we have here in the Mishnah. Now, there's a discussion here in the Rishonim about what we call tarte l'reis. So let's say you have two strikes against you. Let's say the get doesn't have a zman and it has an eid echad. Right? We said a get with an eid echad is possible because it's ma'orer. We entertain the possibility that it was written l'slamin and there was no lishma in the get. That's one negative. One minus here, one strike against you. But there's one aid. On top of that, there's no zman in the get, which the Rabbanan possibly get because there's no zman. So he quotes here a Tosfos at the beginning of Gittin that even if it has these two kesronos, these two faults, it's number one, ein bo zman, number two, teish bo eid echad. Even so, ein a get kosel mid'oraisa, ela midrabbanan. And therefore, all these dinim would apply. So now he has another kash, which I'm trying to figure out here. I was unaware of this Aruch LaNer that he quotes here. Again, we said that we cannot allow Yibum to Sarah because the onlooker thinks that the get that Shimon gave to Rivka is not a valid get. And that makes Sarah into a tzoras erva. So what's the Aruch LaNer's kasha? He's asking, why don't we go the other direction? Let's analyze the impression of the spectator from the perspective of the fact that with this get, Rivka could marry someone else, or at least the evidence, if she got married to someone else, the get would be valid. Now, if that be the case, so what's the Aruch LaNer's kasha? If they think that the get is valid, so what's the problem here? Yesh lachus shema yachshiru. Oh, I see. The Aruch LaNer is asking the opposite direction. If we were to allow Yibum, that would give off the impression to the onlooker that the get that was delivered to Rivka was a valid get. And the Rabbanon want to invalidate the get. So it might come out that she, meaning Rivka, would get married based on this get when the Rabbanon don't want to allow her to get married. But we're going to think that Rivka could get married because, look, they allowed Yibum of Sarah. If they allowed Yibum of Sarah, then obviously the get to Rivka is a valid get. So why does Rashi say, that's the Aruch LaNer's kasha, that the chashash is that people will think that Etzaras Erva is getting married? Why not say the following, that people, again, if you'd allow Yibum, people will say, well, then it must be that the get is valid, and then they're going to simply ship her off to get married. I'm talking about Rivka, to get married based on this get, which Rabbanan disqualify. She'im hoisav misyabemes, smurim means that I think the onlookers, she gets that kosher legaber. See, I would vote in favor of Rashi in this case. Rashi's looking for a chashash in Hilchas Yibum. The Aruch LaNer is looking for a chashash in Hilchas Gerushin. Now, as Rashi is trying to explain why they couldn't allow Yibum, why the Rabbanan couldn't allow Yibum between Shimon and Sarah in Hilchas Yibum terms. The onlooker is going to think that the status of Sarah is that of a Sarah's Erva, because they see that the Rabbanan are not allowing, they're giving, what's her name, Rivka, a very hard time with this kid. They're not allowing her to get married. So how could they allow Yibum to Sarah? If this get is not valid, then Sarah becomes Sarah's Erva. Rashi is really containing himself within the 4 cubits of Hilchas Yibum. The Aruch LaNer is saying something totally different. He's saying that if we allow for Yibum, the people are going to think that the get is valid to what's her name, to Rivka, and they're going to allow Rivka to get married without the get. That's a Gerushin problem. That's not a Yibum problem.
Yeah, but her husband's dead. Shimon's died now. Doesn't matter if he gave her.
Well, if not her, maybe somebody else who got a sibling get.
Oh, I see.
In other words,
You're not looking at her first specific, but in shadow.
right, I think that's what he means.
Because otherwise, husbands die, whether or not, yeah. But yeah, they would look and say, oh, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. You're right. I mean, we have to. All right, let's see the Gemara now. So again, the Mishnah says that. Yeah. So he threw a kedushin, safek karav lo, safek karav lo. Bilu b'safek gerushin, safek karav lo, safek karav lo lo k'tan. My time. Why didn't the Mishnah consistently give the same safek of karav lo, karav lo in the case of get? Instead, the Mishnah stretches its arm out to very complicated scenarios of git that the Rabbanan Pasel just simply go with Karev Law. So he says here, which is brilliant, that you know why the Mishnah didn't mention Suffolk, Karav Lo, Suffolk Karav and Get, is because in such a case, Sarah doesn't even require Chalitza. Why not? Omar Rabba, Isha Zu B'cheskes Hetel Shuk Omedes. Sofek Ataboli Osra, Al Tasrenu Misofek. Wow. If I understand correctly, what Rab is saying, again, what I'm telling you now is very provisional, but let's try it, see if it fits. Rab is saying that once Shimon threw a get in the direction of Rivka, at that moment in time, Sarah gets a cheskas heter to marry Reuven in event that Shimon will die. That's called a cheskes heter. Right? Shalif Nation is Gasher Rivka. I think what he's saying here, this is mind-boggling. What's the status of Sarah l'shuk, meaning if she wants to get married? I mean, without chalitza, right? At this moment in time, before Shimon delivers a get, Suffolk, Karav Losam, before he delivered the get to Rivka, Sarah has a chazaka buteris l'shuk. Why? Because she's a tzaras erba. I mean, it's clear to everyone that Shimon is married to two women, Sarah and Rivka. And Rivka is an erba, and therefore Sarah is a tzaras erba. So if we would freeze that moment in time before he threw that get to Rivka, Sarah could marry anyone in event that Shimon dies. So Sarah has a cheskas muteris l'shuk based on her status of tzaras erba. Now Shimon throws a get. We're going to assume that the destiny of that get, right, the ultimate ruling on that get, will support the same cheskes heter that Sarah has or had before he threw the get, because we don't want to change her status. Meaning she had a status before he threw the get that she's allowed to marry anyone. We want to maintain that status even after Shimon threw a get in the direction of Rivka. So in that context, we're going to justify the get. You follow? Validate the get. By validating the get, we maintain the status of heter vis-a-vis Sarah marrying someone from the shuk. Wow, that's a curveball. Again, she's muteris l'shuk for two different reasons. The original cheskes heter is because she has the status of a tzaras erba. Now we're saying she has a cheskes heter l'shuk. Second. What are you going to say now? That what did the get? If the get is valid, then Sarah needs chalitza. So we're going to say that the get is invalid. Is that it? Right? Vizorka, the get is certainly invalid. And therefore, if the get is invalid, then she doesn't need chalitza. Right? And our Mishnah says that she needs chalitza. He says, "Lochein lo pirish hatana b'safek gerushin kagon zarkas I get safek karav lo safek karav lo lefisha ba'osa b'ofen zeh la'ichem uperes lashuk af below chalitza." And why is that so? Mikah cheskes heter. She had a cheskes heter as a tzaras erva. We're going to maintain her status as a tzaras erva. She doesn't even need, right? She doesn't even need chalitza. How can the Mishnah require chalitza if it's a safek karav lo, safek karav lo? We would maintain her cheskes heter. If the get is valid, then she needs chalitza. So just 1 second. And what I meant to say is that if the get is valid d'oraisa, but posel midrabanan, then we justify why she needs chalitza. So this is the brilliant thesis of Rabbi, which will, Mirza Hashem, will pick it up again tomorrow. And